The Cloudcast is sponsored by Intel Cloud for All, driving the creation of tens of thousands of clouds.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Aaron, how are you tonight?
I'm doing good, we might set a record for consecutive podcasts together here before too much longer.
I know. It was funny. We were talking before the show, and our guest was like, "Hey, I get the full team tonight."
Yeah. It's been fun to actually be able to both be on the podcast together for a change. I mean, we did it at first, when we first started this however many years ago, and then we realized scheduling is hard, and then we just went to this model of as long as there was one of us, go. Yep. And then even sometimes we just had other co-hosts and everything. But now the jobs are for both of us kind of getting somewhat to a point where we're both home, but conference season kicks off before too much longer, and we might be together, but it might be a bar in Vegas, or it seems like a lot of conferences are in Vegas this year, or Moscone yet again, or I don't know.
They're doing
ripping it up.
Yeah, ripping it up. So lots of stuff in Vegas this year, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your bent. So yeah, so cool. So things are good. Your transition's going well. You're still making the transition, or everything's good in your new transition? Yeah.
It's it's definitely a very interesting. We've used this term. So the company, my day job, was acquired by NetApp, and it's been almost a month now. And we've used this term, NetApp speed dating. Getting to know all the people at NetApp that you're supposed to know. And so I've been doing speed dating for the last couple of weeks, and that's finally come to an end. So now it's actually time to go turn the crank and go get some things done.
Yep. Cool. Well, listen. Last week we did a show. We kind of said we got back to our roots and talked about training and learning and all that stuff. And I think the other thing in terms of our roots is always said, look, we're not in Silicon Valley. We're out in Raleigh. We interact with the Valley quite a bit, but we also come from backgrounds that are a little more diverse. And so we thought tonight was going to be fun. Our guest today, Keith Townsend, who is, a lot of folks will know Keith as at CTO Advisor on Twitter, runs the CTO Advisor blog and podcast, is really out there, but also is a senior SAP infrastructure architecture at AbbVie. So Keith, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Sometimes Aaron and I joke that scheduling is always the hardest part of the podcast. Sometimes we do a really good job. We plan way ahead. We'll book 3 or 4 shows in advance, and sometimes somebody just says something on Twitter and we go, "Hey, you want to come on the show?" And that's what would happen this week is Keith made a comment about some stuff around DevOps and containers. And we said, you know what? You are really good you've got a very pragmatic view of things. You're in Chicago, but you get to interact with sort of people all over the place. You were just out in Australia. We'll talk about that. But we thought, you know what? Let's get back to a little bit of pragmatism. The market, people are worried about the market maybe getting a little soft, and so let's talk a little bit about some of the new stuff, but also talk a little bit about kind of the realities of large companies and how fast they can do stuff that aren't in Silicon Valley. So first off, welcome to the show. You are a very well-known podcaster and out in the community, but it's first time on the show for you. So welcome aboard.
Appreciate you guys having me on.
So first off, just as a background for anybody that doesn't know you, talk a little bit about your background, some of the things you do in the broader communities, and then a little bit about you recently moved from being a consultant at a very large consulting firm to being back on the sort of quote unquote customer side. You're an IT practitioner again. So give folks a little bit of your background, because it's very rich, and we're going to have some good discussions tonight.
So I spent most of my career on the customer side here in Chicago, up until maybe about 2009, 2010, when the overall market changed for a lot of us quite a bit. Very typical director of IT, network operations manager, very typical customer side career. And then the big recession hit us, and I needed to the company folded, and I needed to find a new job. So I went out East Coast to Lockheed Martin, worked in their IT services group for quite some time. An extremely enlightening career or a extremely enlightening job. I got to learn proper engineering. I thought I was an engineer to that point, but no. when you do a RCA and you do it the same way that they go about doing an RCA when a shuttle tanker explodes. That helps you really understand engineering and the engineering process. Really enjoyed that experience. Got a little homesick, and the wife wanted to move back to Chicago. So I took a job, you mentioned, with PwC, one of the big four consultancies out there. They were looking to ramp up their IT practice, specifically the data center practice. So I joined that data center practice. Got a chance to look at IT from a completely different lens. Before, it was a lot of, even at Lockheed, when I was the enterprise architect for the Department of Housing, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. I got a chance to look at a lot of great technologies while I was there, but this is PwC get me in kind of the boardroom and looking at problems from the business side. Do we outsource IT versus bring it in? We've gotten breached, and meaning one of our customers had gotten breached. How do we reassure the markets and bring back some credibility to those organizations? And the last customer I worked with at V, we're splitting a Fortune 50 company is splitting into two, basically Fortune 50 companies, similar to what HPE did. How do you do that in 2 years? So I spent a year on that project, and then I came along as a full-time employee for them a couple of months after I left PwC.
Wow, fantastic. Now, let me ask you a little bit about your views. So you stay very up to date on pretty much all the modern technologies, and it's very evident through all of your different social outlets. But yet, like you mentioned, you also work large enterprise in the Midwest. And Brian and I have these conversations on a very regular basis of just how different, for instance, the Raleigh landscape is, or the Carolinas landscape is from, say, the Bay Area echo chamber. And so what is your view of kind of the world? You've talked to a lot of customers, and kind of give us a little bit of perspective on what has been your take that you've seen.
You know what? People are pretty unique outside of the Valley. I don't know if the people in the Valley are pretty unique. I think that's a better take on it, because if you're on Twitter a lot, or if you're reading blogs, you think, everyone's doing cloud native. You guys are doing a great job on this show at helping us stay up to speed on like network overlays, containers, Docker, data center orchestration. All that stuff is great. And for the 5% of the need that's out there, there has to be an outlet for that. But for the rest of the world, we're still trying to figure out how to bring up VMs faster. So it's quite a different pace. While we have, and I'm not talking generically about AbbVie, I'm talking about most of the customers that I've dealt with, other Fortune 500s, very simple problems. We think about how are we going to monitor containers. Is a show you guys had on with like Datadog over almost a year ago. The basic question of how do we do patch management for HPUX is still a predominant question in the traditional enterprise. So yeah, it's quite a different scene from what we get portrayed and what's going on in the Valley.
Yeah, so it's always interesting. I know Aaron and I get a chance sometimes to talk to analysts and financial analysts and different people, and a lot of times they're sort of asking the question, and sometimes in technology we have this tendency to make everything binary. We want to sort of know winners and losers and what kills what. And I spent a few days this week talking to some certain analysts, and they would ask questions literally like, is everything going to go to AWS? Is it just them and everybody else sort of falls and falters? And it is weird. It's weird to see that mentality, especially when you put certain things in context, right? You've got something like Docker, which we have no idea if they're making any revenue. They might be, but they're private. They don't announce numbers. Amazon is growing at an incredible rate, but they're still an $8 billion company. And you think about that in the context of how big is Microsoft, how big is Oracle, how big is SAP, how big is a dozen other companies, or more than that. And sometimes you have to put some of these things in context. You're right. Twitter tends to be a very loud megaphone for a very small percentage of the IT industry.
Yeah, I think to put things in perspective, I gave a OpenStack brown bag maybe about a year ago. And of a group of potentially 20 engineers, 10% showed up. So 2 people to an OpenStack brown bag. Like, what is introduction to OpenStack? What is OpenStack? A few months later, I did a cloud native brown bag, almost a full room. And it speaks, I think, to the pain points of the enterprise in general. We mentioned AWS and containers and orchestration and cloud native. And what I'm finding, and it's not just my experience at AbbVie, but customers as well, and the enterprise moves slow in one aspect, but a lot of the pain points still exist that we've always fought. One, database licensing. How do we reduce the Oracle bill? 2, we're being asked by the business to do things faster. What I find interesting, though, is, we talk a lot about cloud native. What the ask from a lot of the businesses that I've talked to is not how do I make scale out cloud native applications, but how do I get pets faster? I want a VM and I want it fast. I want it, within 30 minutes and an hour, I'm going to use it. And then I'm going to try and treat it like like cattle and throw it away. But basically I want the cattle. I want the cattle speed, but the pet mentality. So it's it's an interesting mix between what reality is and kind of what when we talk to analysts and when we talk to the market vendors, what they're pushing versus what the enterprise is consuming.
Yeah, and it's almost as if, it's a lot of times people almost talk down to the enterprise is slow, the enterprise doesn't see this, the enterprise is this, the enterprise is that. But I've always seen it as the enterprise knows they have a problem. They're just slow to fix it. They're just they seem to be very tolerant to pain at times, and it is a little bit of inertia, without a doubt, with that.
And a lot of this stuff is just flat hard. I mentioned that. Well, actually, I didn't. In the right before we started recording, I mentioned that AbbVie is a former subsidiary of Abbott Labs. We split off from Abbott. So let's talk about speed. The company was over $100 billion company. We're splitting into 2 $50 billion companies, roughly. Simple math. AbbVie quickly made an acquisition. Now they're an $85 billion company. In 2 years' time period, you have to stand up. You split IT teams. AbbVie has to stand up a completely new enterprise organization, stay competitive in a market, in a very competitive market where we are looking at the landscape of our blockbuster drug coming off of patent. We need to stay ahead of the curve from a product perspective. And also, not just IT, but the rest of the organization has to split and keep moving forward. They successfully did that in 2 years. So while we talk about how slow the enterprise is in like adopting new technologies, when the rubber hits the road and the business is at risk or there's business opportunity, the enterprise can move as fast as it needs to move, just not in areas of technology that we would like sometimes.
Right. Well, and I think the realities of it is, there's a lot of people talking about, Netflix, and it took 7 years. You wrote a nice piece up about, what it means in terms of, if one of the companies who's the poster child of being sort of the new way of doing it took them that long. But, I think, like, I saw the same thing at the DevOps Enterprise Summit, which is Gene Kim's event, which is kind of, it's in the Valley, it's talking about new cool stuff, but the companies are, the Fortune 100. It's Target and Macy's and Nordstrom's and, Nationwide Insurance and, companies that you're like, oh yeah, that's what I would consider sort of, big enterprise companies. So I think you're right. I think we all sort of have to reset ourselves in terms of, if there's a business imperative to go really fast, but just in terms of, generally having to go fast, sometimes it may be a company-wide thing, and sometimes it just may not be that big of a priority to go fast in some new cloud-native thing or Docker thing or container thing or whatever it is. So, but let's do this. So, part of the reason we had you on today was you were kind of were kind of riffing, and you kind of threw out a tweet, and you said, "Hey, I've been looking at VMware, I've been looking at containers, I've been looking at DevOps and stuff, and you kind of said, I'm trying to figure out who's going to run it, who's going to pay for it, and do some of the incumbent companies like a VMware maybe have a better shot at being successful there than maybe the Clouderati wants to give them credit for." What were some of your thoughts as you were sending out that tweet, and some of the things you've been thinking about in that space?
So, we've talked about how slow the enterprise is to adopt certain technologies, what the priorities are, big Oracle applications, SAP, I'm an SAP architect. This is where the big money applications are, but there's opportunities in the small pockets. Mm-hmm. So the ability to bring in a small team, have them create a strategic cloud native application and change. I think there's true value in that in large organizations where you can bring in tiger teams to create applications, move them to operations, and move them forward. I think where VMware has a great opportunity is this operations model. You guys have talked about it on the podcast, this day two. After we've built the application, how do we manage it? Enterprises are slow when it comes to operational change. How do we operate these applications? And when you look at the VMware kind of cloud native and container story, it appeals. Are you putting a wrapper around vSphere, putting a container wrapper interface in front of vSphere? The workloads from an infrastructure perspective look exactly as they look today. I manage it as I do today, but I give these cloud native developers the interface that they need, as opposed to bringing in Kubernetes and Docker, Swarm from Docker, and building up a whole new discipline practice for 5% of the applications. I think VMware has an argument on why choose the VMware path.
Yeah, well, it's sort of, to a certain extent, and for anybody that doesn't know this space, I know we had Kit Colbert on from VMware a little while ago. It was a short show at DockerCon. The VMware sort of has two offerings. Obviously, everybody knows VMware from a virtualization perspective, create VMs, highly available, all that sort of stuff. And they sort of have two offerings. One of them is sort of the native, VMware offering that has some initial integration with a container OS and Docker, and they call it VMware integrated containers. And as I think about it, you made the comment before, like, the enterprise sort of wants, pets in terms of, they want to spin up the thing they know. They want to do pets faster, spin them up in 30 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever. But they sort of like the mindset of cattle in terms of, hey, if I can throw it away, throw it away. And it feels a little bit, and I think this is where you're going, is, from a large enterprise perspective that has a VMware footprint, has an operations team and a tooling set that's around VMware, it sort of fits that model that you're talking about, where it is some blend of, it's pets in terms of operationally, but it's sort of cattle in terms of speed. And if the development team, want to throw containers on top of it, well, they don't know any different, right? You're just giving it to them. You're just giving them, resources to put it on. And that's where you're going with that.
Yeah, and let me throw actually another wrinkle into the mix too. It also could be more than just, especially in enterprise space, more than just, hey, this is technology based. It could be comfort level of the vendor based. At the end of the day, let's face facts. VMware is going to be in most enterprise accounts. It's going to be a name that is known, hopefully well liked and trusted, but at least known. Versus some of these other technologies, right? And again, it goes back to the slow to change, slow to adopt topics you were talking about early. Sometimes it may come down to simply confidence level too, don't you think?
I think enterprise customers trust the vendors that take them out to dinner. And it's not just, we make fun about, golden golf clubs, as I've risen up in my career. I've yelled at a lot of vendors. I've gotten on the phone and chewed out a lot of folks. But with that chewing out comes a level of trust. because, that next deal, they know that if they sell me something that doesn't pan out, we're going to have a very, very difficult conversation afterwards. And I think we discredit that level of trust in the enterprise when it comes to our traditional enterprise vendors. There's the new and the fresh. The folks at Pure are giving me a presentation on all the cool stuff they're doing with HANA. And I have to tell you, the first thing that the first ideal that I'm fighting that comes to my head was like, man, but these other guys, when it went down, when SAP went down and I needed to get folks on the phone and get it back up and running, they were there, and I can find 100 people in my market that can support it.
Yeah, and you could almost play a bunch of what if games based off of just that theory, right? Okay, what if Docker was bought by, I don't know, somebody, let's say Microsoft, right? Any of the big shops, right? Docker was bought by VMware. Would they be more trusted in the enterprise because it's a Microsoft product, or it is a VMware product versus it being a Docker product?
Look at what EMC did with Data Domain. It's that type of, it becomes that type of relationship. Aaron, you guys just got acquired by NetApp. That changes the conversation for a lot of customers.
Agreed. Absolutely. Now, let's switch gears for a second. We're also seeing a trend. We're talking about trends here. You're seeing a trend in overlay technologies in the market, right? Where containers, whether it's SDN, security. We had Illumio on here recently. How do you see those working in today's kind of siloed IT environments, right? Brian and I have had long discussions at times over, when it's these overlay technologies or these, moving up the stack, if you will. Well, that works great and looks great in, on PowerPoint slides, or looks great in demos, but sometimes it breaks down simple as like, hey, what department is going to pay for it?
I've had this comment about Docker for a long time. I went to VMworld, well, not VMworld. I went to the VMUGs in Australia, both Melbourne and Sydney one, and at both about 300 people each. And that region of the world has adopted virtualization probably better than anyone else. And at each, I asked who has containers in production at the keynotes. No one raised their hands. And I think that's a indication. But if you talk to them one-on-one, they'll tell you that developers are most definitely using Docker and containers in development, but it is not making its way to production. And I think one of the siloed issues that we reach to is when developers are using it on their laptops, it's free. Support is the community. When you look to move it to production, that really changes the conversation. And it becomes who's going to pay for it. We talk about infrastructure type stuff. Who pays for the core switches in the enterprise? Who pays for support for OS clustering? Even though the app teams leverage and depend on OS clustering in a very capable core data center network, they don't bear any of that cost. And I think that's a huge barrier for overlay technologies that are pushed from the development team into the operating silo. Now, on the flip side, when you talk about network virtualization, I think from a silo perspective, everybody wants it, and paying for it is not as big of a deal. Because VMware did a great job at positioning NSX as, let's say, as a firewall replacement, that if you're doing a major firewall refresh, then the network team can pick up that cost within their budget. Or if you're doing a cloud native project, the server team can pick up. So that plays nicely with silos. What doesn't play nicely is when you go to implement it, and the questions around control, I think, are bigger issues for the network overlay.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that Aaron and I find. We end up talking to a lot of these startups, or we'll talk to people at events that there's an interesting podcast, the the A16Z. So it's Andreessen Horowitz's company does a podcast. Good show for anybody who wants to sort of get up above the technology. But they were talking to Martin Casado, who had just, was the founder of Nicira, just recently left, went over there. And he was talking about it, and he was saying, it's the infrastructure piece is interesting. You're now touching developers with it because it is this software-based stuff. It interacts with things through APIs. And he was trying to kind of make this point about, well, you've got to have an open source component of it. But at the same time, he still couldn't, even just talking to a bunch of VCs who want to know about how you're going to make money, kind of couldn't lay out how you're going to make money in these models where developers are somehow going to start paying for stuff when they don't have budget, or you're building a product that starts with open source and you're going to try and kind of go open core and commercialize it. And, I think more than anything, when we talk to a lot of the people that are in that domain, they don't lack for cool technology, but I don't think they have a complete grasp on, how hard it is to get to people that have to buy stuff, right? It's not that they don't have a problem, but you still got to get to the groups that have budget. And a lot of times those end up being the operations teams, even though the product is quote unquote sort of a developer focused kind of product. And I think Docker sort of fits right into that domain. It rides the fence between, is it a developer product? Is it an infrastructure product? It kind of blurs those lines, which, I think is why you brought up the question. It makes it sort of tricky to go like, well, who would buy it and then who would support it? And those may be the same thing. They may be different things.
Yeah, I forget the former VMware CTO that went over to VC, but he did a great job at VMworld talking about that very issue of when he's looking at infrastructure technologies to invest in. Yep. He ultimately asked the question, who's going to buy this? Who's going to pay the bill?
Steve Herod.
Yeah, it was. It was Herod.
He did an awesome job.
Yes, absolutely.
So let me ask this, Keith. So you go by the handle CTO advisor. Obviously, you in a previous job and in your current job, you're talking to CIOs as well. Let's say you're in that role, and you're in an industry that's going through a certain amount of change. So for example, you're in the automotive industry. Things like Tesla and Uber and the car automation is kind of front and center for you. You're in, I don't know, the hotel industry, things like Airbnb. So let's say you're sort of in that, you're that top dog. You're in an industry that feels like it's got some competitive pressure from some of these companies. Like how are you thinking about it at that level in terms of people, process, some of the technology? What's the guidance you hear, or what kind of guidance do you give to people at that level when you're thinking about, how do you keep up with this stuff and how do you make it, relevant to your company?
CIOs have a tough enough job when they're just trying to manage risk. So it's not, when you talk about innovation, that's not, one of their core competencies. And honestly, my advice to CIOs is to go out and talk to a Brian Gracely, a Aaron Delp, a Keith Townsend, a Ken Hoy. Hire one of these guys, pay them as much as you can pay them, and put them on cool projects, and let them understand and learn your business, and let them just sit down and think. These are really, really, really tough problems. As we talk about, Gartner pushes the bimodal or whatever they call it model in IT. I don't think that's really going to work in the large enterprise. For most large enterprises, I think some do it well. Target might be an example, but I think for the average enterprise, you can't turn over your entire staff overnight. Finding developers that can build cloud native applications are hard. Finding partners that can build them is hard. You need someone who's vested, not just a consultant. You need someone who understands the business, and that's a thinker who can, think about thought leadership and influencers, who's meeting with the Valley, meeting with other companies, understanding what they're practically doing, and bringing back those lessons learned internally, and being Greg Farrell over at the Packet Pushers likes to use the term force factor, becoming a change agent internally to help gradually change the culture and bring some of these ideals in. You really need to throw, one of the things I appreciated with working at PwC is that they could throw 90 really smart people in a room and solve a problem that was a parallel problem. This is a problem that you need to really throw, I think, smart people at, give them latitude to not necessarily, a set day-to-day job. Just, learn the business, go out, see what's in the market, come back, bring that smart stuff back, and help us become Walmart.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point. I think I had a chance to talk to Amy and John and Matt over at Geek Whisperers, and we talked about this idea of, you sort of have to have this idea of pioneers sometimes that are just going out and finding what's out there, and then you can't just have sort of these renegade people. You've got to have kind of an established way to then get it back and make it mainstream, make it owned in your business, make it part of your DNA, and whether you call that a settler or a town planner, like you kind of have to think about it as, it's not, like they said, bimodal. It's got to be sort of this continuum, and they're different people who fit those kind of jobs. I mean, there's different people who like the risk, there's different people who like the uncertainty, and there's others that are really good at getting it into the system and getting it scaled and getting it into the DNA of companies. So no, I think that's really, really good advice. Let me ask you one last question just to sort of wrap this up. Like, one of the other questions we get all the time, kind of back channel and off the record and stuff, is what becomes the role of systems integrators, especially as things like cloud start to come along, where things are, off premises, or sort of agile development or DevOps, where it's not just change control, it's kind of more frequent change. Like what becomes the role of those big SIs, or even smaller types of SIs?
One of the things that I look for in an SI today is someone who understands my business. Technologists, for the most part, I was surprised. I was talking to a systems integrator yesterday, and he was one of the guys who listens closely to the community. He knew who I was. He knows you guys. He was actually a V specialist at EMC one time. So he's very close to the community. So you can find those really smart technical guys. I think SIs really need to understand the business, specifically your business and the risk profile of your company, and add that additional, we all talk about moving higher up the stack. The ability to spin up Amazon EC2 images using JSON is a skill that can be taught. What's more important or valuable is having a systems integrator that understands how to apply those technologies and help with the business change. And specifically the business change within IT. I think Big Fours don't particularly do a good job at understanding the technology deeply and understand the business part of it too much, and then want to get too involved in the technology. Sometimes you just need a really great systems integrator that really understands the technology and has a strong basic business acumen, especially for your industry and hopefully your company specifically.
No, that's great. Absolutely. Hey, Keith, we need to we're getting to that point here. We need to wrap it up a little bit. So where can everyone find you on Twitter, in case they didn't get the Twitter handle up front, and the podcast and the blog and everything else?
So you can find me at CTO Advisor on Twitter, and the blog is, I couldn't get CTOadvisor.com. So it's a the in front of it, www.thectoadvisor.com.
Fantastic.
All the best podcasts have a the in front of them. So we endorse that. Well, listen, man, this has been great. We talked to Aaron and I were talking. We've never met you in person, but we feel like we know you pretty well because we talk to you all the time on Twitter and other stuff. And folks, if you're not following Keith, a really good, I always sort of call it pragmatic. That's maybe not the right word, but just you do a really good job of you're vendor neutral, although you know the vendor stuff really well. You're living with sort of the real pace of change. You're kind of out there as a thought leader. You're not afraid to poke people. So a lot of you create a lot of good stuff. And the thing I like about it is sometimes it's written, sometimes it's video, sometimes it's podcast. Like it's in very consumable format. So that part is very cool. And we hope you keep it up because it's always really good insight.
I really enjoy it. I really appreciate the feedback.
Yeah. So, well, folks, with that, we're going to wrap it up. For Keith and for Aaron, as always, everybody, thanks for listening. And if you like the show, if you have any feedback, always send us the feedback. And we love it when you tell a friend about what we're doing, because we like growing the show and getting you new stuff out there. So for everybody, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.